Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. Welcome everyone who's joining online right now. You're very, very welcome. We are just opening and starting our 2.5-day conference on social and humanitarian assistance in crises, agendas, ambitions, and aspirations for more effective intervention. This session, we are going to talk, myself, Rachel Sabates-Wheeler, and the co-PIs that have been helping run the basic program, Rachel Slater, Jeremy Lind, and Paul Harvey. We're going to talk to you about some of the key messages that have been coming out of basic that are going to be framing this conference, but also over the next 2 days, there's themes that you can choose to go with. So we'll highlight some of those themes as we talk through this presentation. Sorry. There we all are, our mugshots. Paul looks like he's having fun on the beach somewhere. Great, so yes, that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. So why are we here? That's kind of a big philosophical question, maybe existential for some of us. Why are we here, specifically here at IDS today? I was talking to Carol Watson over breakfast this morning, and she reminded me that the first time we'd met was somewhere back in 2006, when we were running 2-week UNICEF residential social protection courses here at IDS. We did tons. Social protection was this blossoming, massive agenda that was just sort of kicking off 2000s. And there's just been so much of work on social protection, evidence being everywhere, as we all know. So many of us have worked in social protection. And over the years, the Centre for Social Protection, we've hosted multiple conferences. In fact, just 2 years ago, we had a conference here called Reimagining Social Protection. And a number of you were at that conference. And you'll remember that we thought, actually, at that point, it needed a rethink. Social protection needed a rethink in a setting of many uncertainties. We were just coming out of COVID, the aftermath of the pandemic was on us, and climate change issues were very prevalent, and lots of automation taking away jobs. We're thinking about livelihoods. But here we are 2 years later on, and the world actually looks very different again, right? And we're thinking, crikey, we were thinking about 2 years ago how to reimagine, but now conflicts continue. We've got a lot of humanitarian, devastating consequences of all kinds of shocks and crises in many parts of the world. And the responses of governments, for example, to the crisis in Gaza, have cast long shadows over what we're going to do, global orders, right? Levels of humanitarian need are enormous. They're alarmingly high, and cuts. We've seen cuts left, right, and center. And there's all of a sudden a focus on prioritization. What are we going to do with the funding, that little funding we have? And we've still got legacies of the pandemic. And again, we're thinking, what's going on? There's shifting priorities. We can see them day to day of the aid agencies. All of a sudden, we're seeing a big focus on growth. We're not too interested in rights anymore and universal social protection. We can't possibly be. So what about growth? How do we justify any sort of welfare provision on growth terms? That's 20 years ago we were doing that. So why are we here? Well, I think we're here because we're still, given all this stuff going on, we're not going to give up. We are still deeply concerned about the poorest and the most vulnerable. Just 2 nights ago, I was watching on TV on BBC about the issues going on in Afghanistan for women at the moment. Horrific. I was sobbing. I think my husband told me I just had to get it together and carry on. But it's horrific what's going on, okay? And so we're here because we want to imagine, reimagine, reset, whatever you want to call it, what we're doing. How do we continue? Because the need is even more significant than it has been, right? We don't just give up, we carry on. So what's our purpose? Another big existential question. What's our purpose? Here, this week, these 2.5 days, we want to get behind the commitments we've already made globally. We want to contribute to reaching 500 million people with social protection. We've made a global commitment to that. What about the commitments made at the World Social Summit 2025 and Seville Platform for Action, that in those countries that hardly have any social protection, we want to see at least 2 percentage growth points every year. We want to do that. And how are we going to do that? We're going to do it because you guys know you've been working in this sector for years. You've been working across humanitarian social protection. We can share evidence. We can share insights. That's what these 2.5 days are about. We can learn from each other. We can rethink, what does a reset look like? We know that's what people are talking about now. How do we reset? How do we innovate? How do we move forward, right? How do we do these things together? And that's what we want to really encourage each other to do. Keep going. I won't go through what basic research is, but in detail, because we did that just earlier. But for those online, Better Assistance in Crisis is a research program that IDS has been hosting. A lot of people have been involved with, or have been consuming the outputs of, or critiquing the outputs of. And we've been really interested in looking at what social and humanitarian assistance work looks like in protracted crisis settings. And we've been working a lot across a lot of difficult contexts. So there's key messages that have come out of our research, but also lots of the work you guys are doing that we've shared. We're just going to highlight some of those. This is available online as well for those of you who obviously are not here. And so we'll just go through some of the key messages. I'll present a couple and then I'll hand over to my co-investigators. Key messages, some that we want to talk about over the next few days. First of all, when we have crises, protracted crises, conflicts, whatever, we want to prioritize the protective functions of social provisioning, social assistance. We want to, first and foremost, we want to protect lives. We want to aim to protect basic consumption and prevent the erosion of health and education and food and nutrition. And that might be obvious, we want to protect lives, but social provision and social protection tends to try and do everything for everyone all the time. Promotive, we want to improve this, we want to do this, we want to add nutrition, we want to add a training program. And when you're in the midst of a strong acute crisis, we want to say, no, let's just hunker down and make sure we're protecting lives. Let's do the basics well. So we want to make sure that we focus on reducing vulnerability and provide stability with predictable support. However we do that, even if we have to pivot away from other programs, we want to make sure people are protected, their lives are protected. And in acute crisis, we have some messages that we'll talk about over the next, say, 2.5 days. There's a session on targeting when we say, you know what, we might just have to go for good enough. We're not going to go for perfect. We can't go for the most accurate. We can't go for the most, but we need to go for good enough. What does good enough look like? Example on the other side of the slide, maybe we just go for a no regrets targeting policy and we just prioritize speed over precision. We think, so there's things we can talk about around that, and avoid Christmas trees. Some of you will have heard that analogy to social protection programs in terms of the amount that social protection is expected to do for everyone everywhere. We need to stop hanging every kind of development initiative and a humanitarian initiative on a social protection intervention and just go for protection. Second, we want to protect livelihoods as much as we can. Lives, yes, of course, definitely, but as much as we can. We know that we are working in situations of compounding shocks, right? In Ethiopia and Niger, our work shows that people's capacity to withstand hardships brought about by conflict are absolutely tied to repeated cycles of drought. So there absolutely is these polycrises, overlapping crises. And what do we do about that? We don't just say, oh gosh, there's a conflict crisis, let's put everything over here. We think, oh no, well, we have actually been working over here. We need to lean into that as much as we can still. We need to think about the climate side as well. We need to think cross-sectorally and what kind of responses. I mean, what we do know is social protection's promotive potential can face severe limits when you've got a conflict, for example. And what can we do, therefore, to make sure we're protecting the gains that were made in times of stability during a crisis? We've done work on cash plus programs. And we think maybe that plus part of a cash plus needs some rethinking in crisis situations. Maybe we're not looking at the right type of pluses. There are pluses that you would use in a very stable context. So we just want to say, we want to protect the prior gains through predictable provision. That's actually a really good way of ensuring people retain a level of resilience. We've got quite a lot of evidence, particularly from Ethiopia, saying that a mix of humanitarian and social protection through the productive safety net program, the complementarities between them actually provided both protection to lives and to livelihoods during the Tigray conflict. So over to Rach.
Hi, everybody. I'm the other Rachel, which is very confusing for some people and for me and Rachel too. If you find it easier to call me Rach, that's what we generally do. But if you get it wrong, it's not a problem at all. We're very used to the confusion and to taking credit for one another's work, right? So, okay, so the area that I'm going to focus in on is the importance of focusing on sustaining national systems. This part of basic work emerged when we were thinking about countries which had relatively established social protection systems, often with high levels of coverage, and then a severe crisis, particularly a conflict. Now, at the time when we started, the social protection world, including us, was very excited about shock responsive social protection, very focused on how we expand programs during a crisis, how we piggyback on programs to bring new people into them, how we expand horizontally, how we expand vertically, and so on. And what we found in the early stages was that making sure that old people who had a pension before a crisis were still getting their pension, or that people below the poverty line still were in receipt of some sort of benefit, or people identified as living with a disability. All of that was a bit of a blind spot, both for all of us, but also for international actors. Older people depending on pensions don't suddenly find other sources of income when there's a conflict. People with disabilities don't go well if either their benefits stop or they get lumped into a broader category of conflict-affected people because they have different needs. So having spent 5 years researching what does it look like to sustain your existing programs, our first message is to ask international actors to focus more on maintaining and sustaining existing social protection systems and programs. And the big focus here is on the word existing programs. We need a shift in the way that we go about development to maintaining and sustaining what's already there. But in the development sector, we don't really like doing that. We like to build things. We like to develop things. International actors, as become apparent in our work, really like to import a new model or have a new idea or some new initiative. And they don't generally focus on keeping going what's already there. They want to invent, they want to start with a blank slate rather than adapt to that piece of paper that's got an awful lot on it already. The second message is about what we need to know in order to do that. So if we delve into which programs do get sustained, never mind which ones we have personal preferences about, then we start to see that there are a combination of financial, economic, and political reasons that mean that programs are sustained. So the extent to which a program is well established, how long it's been running, whether the systems and procedures are well documented, whether staff know what they're doing, that all matters. And if it's a new program, it's unlikely it's going to survive. And what we see time and time again in BASIC is newly established, internationally supported cash transfer programs collapsing, while long-standing domestic funded programs endure. But we're not very good at supporting some of those domestic programs. We also find that political settlements and social contracts really matter. So programs that are part of the social contract will endure, and those that are not part of people's expectations or entitlements will wither. And finally, programs that are intertwined with other things endure. So especially those that are linked up to wider elements of a national economy or wider elements of people's livelihoods. And they endure because stopping them has a whole series of knock-on effects that we don't get with standalone cash transfer programs. The third message is something that we've really zoomed in on in basic research to complement other research that's happening on the sustain question, particularly in our sister project STAR, and you can hear more about that in some of the panels. There's lots of investment to build capacity to deliver and to sustain social protection, but most of it is rooted in MIS systems and digitization. These are part, but not all, of what's needed. And evidence from various countries highlights the importance of the social protection workforce, how investments in social workers or social protection workers on the front line, especially when they're recruited locally, can result in better outcomes for people living in poverty or that are vulnerable or marginalised. And it also is something that helps build trust and belief in government to deliver when we maintain that connection through a touch point between social workers and recipients. And I think that, to quote Rachel's husband, we can't keep just shrugging about the hardships that social protection workers face in their daily lives and expect them to carry on without supporting them. So we're really looking forward to sharing experiences over the next few days about how we sustain existing social protection, not just how we scale it up. Okay, the other thing that I'm going to talk about is the work that we've been doing on gender equity and social inclusion. So on the right-hand side of the slide in the box, we've got 5 recommendations that emerge from right across basic research about gender equity and social inclusion, calling it GESI for short. And this is something that where we've done both tailored, very focused pieces of work about GESI, but we've also tried to mainstream it across the whole of the thematic scope of BASIC. So 5 main messages: exclusion, marginalisation of people because of perceptions of various elements of their identity, religion, political allegiances, plus disability, gender and other factors. Not new to any of us. We also saw what we've called adverse inclusion. So people get included in a programme, but there are negative ramifications of that for them. So lack of privacy, loss of dignity, feelings of shame, risks of sexual harassment to get into a programme or worse. Now, none of this is news to you, right? Those findings aren't exclusive to crisis-affected settings. They happen everywhere. They happen here in the UK. But they can be all the more serious when they're overlaid with things like trauma associated with conflict, with violence, with displacement. And so we need to ensure that social protection mitigates and does not magnify these kinds of exclusion and adverse inclusion risks. Part of the way that we do this is by being cautious about targeting based on simple social and demographic categories, even when they appear to be the path of least resistance for targeting inaccessible contexts. The other part that we mitigate is by doing better to recognise what happens when intersectionality, so the reality of being a specific religion who's been displaced and a woman, and all of those different identity features intersecting, but also intersecting with the wider world, with different combinations of compounding crises. And then finally, the last point about gendered risks to social workers. The arguments that I made in the previous slide about the social workforce, they have gender and social dimensions themselves. So particularly with women social workers being exposed to huge risks in the course of their work that we need to address. So tackling these GESI challenges takes us, I think, collectively to one particular place in basic research, which is about participation and how we bring more people into decision-making and design processes about social protection. And we have a list of things that we think really need to happen, recognising violence and trauma from conflicts and bringing it into the way that we programme social protection, focusing on the discrimination risks that arise because of conflict, not just because of individual social identity features. Incorporating things like care and complementary support where people have experienced violence and trauma, so getting away from thinking a cash transfer programme is enough. And the way that we get to all of this, we think, is by establishing more and better mechanisms or invigorating and improving the existing mechanisms that we have that allow vulnerable and marginalised people's voices to be heard within social protection design and redesign. And looking forward to sharing the experiences on Jessie from various people at the conference in some of these sessions. So over to Jeremy.
Great, thank you, Rach, and thank you, Rachel. Really nice to be with all of you here and online. So a further pillar of research for BASIC has examined the politics of social assistance in crises, including the role of international actors in domestic politics and policy processes. And in this respect, our work has sought to document an emerging, what we call social protection first agenda that some of you here in the room are using and are contributing to as well, which is concerned with developing systems to deliver support that is adjacent to, connected with, and where possible, routed through national institutions. So key elements of this agenda, some of which we've referred to by the previous speakers, include advocating a shift from short-term humanitarian funding to predictable, flexible financing, strengthening state capacities, including frontline workforces, social registries, and digital tools, and increasing coordination between humanitarian and development actors. However, despite some momentum behind this agenda, it is threatened by ongoing reductions in overseas development finance. Crucially, the social protection first agenda lacks institutionalization in protracted crisis countries. As a quote here from someone we interviewed for our global review from a global aid agency shared with us. Its success depending on committed champions and donor resources, making it vulnerable to shifts in political circumstances and aid priorities. Efforts to expand the role of social protection in protracted crises, as we've already heard, require conflict sensitivity. In other words, that there is an alertness amongst planners and implementers to how these interventions interact with their settings, and that there are mechanisms in place to not only do no harm, but possibly do more good by contributing to social cohesion and peace building. While on paper, social protection policies and plans often overlook conflict, in practice, there's a body of experience developing from the bottom up as frontline officials adapt delivery approaches. And we argue that there is much more need for monitoring, learning, and investment in these. Much of what basic research has focused on is social assistance. Yet when looking at the fuller set of social protection instruments, be they food and fuel subsidies, insurance mechanisms, and so forth, as well as the networks and relations beyond the state that are involved in social provisioning, domestic political influences are the dominant power. Basic research across a number of settings, from rural Niger to displaced communities in the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Lebanon, to Sudan, have demonstrated that informal networks and relationships often step in to provide support where both state and international actors are falling short. The clear implication for international aid is to start with the instruments and networks that exist, to connect with a point that Rach shared earlier. And with declining levels of international aid, strengthening capacities around these, whether they are local state officials at the front line or non-state actors that play critical roles, is more important than ever. Some of the work that will be presented at this conference, from Niger to the Horn of Africa to Syria, all make the case that we need to find ways to link formal interventions with local solidarity mechanisms. However, there is a need for a healthy wariness of these, a need for political analyses of these, to be attuned to the exclusions that sometimes relate to these, and the necessity of accountability. Finally, in connection with our work on the politics of social assistance, BASIC, led by Sophia Swithern, who will be presenting here at the conference, has also investigated how international actors might support sustained financing. So in recent years, since 2018, official development financing for social protection and crises has more than quadrupled from 1 billion to nearly 5 billion. But much of this support is unevenly spread, as Sophia's work has documented, with the money tending to go to a few countries, and the lion's share of the finance coming from a single actor, the World Bank. The share of overseas development finance spent on social protection is still dwarfed by that spent on humanitarian aid or on comparably costed SDGs, such as health and education. It's also far below what the ILO estimates is needed to fill the financing gap for social protection, not just in protracted crises, but across all lower and middle income countries. So social protection programs will have to make a strong case for why they should be a priority, both for multilateral and bilateral aid agencies that face difficult decisions on how to allocate shrinking resources, as well as aid recipient states that are expected to shoulder more of the financing burden. Over to Paul.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. I'm conscious you'll all want to get to Q&A and you're bored of hearing from us. So I'll do my best to be reasonably brief. I'm going to focus on sort of 2 points. The reminding us that what we're here to talk about over the next couple of days are a really difficult set of places where extraordinary levels of violence are unfolding, where colleagues of the people in this room have been killed, they're currently under arrest. There's been a new wave of arrests in Yemen. Extraordinary numbers of people have been killed this year in Sudan and Gaza and last year. And so people trying to deliver social assistance in crisis are doing that at tremendous risk to their own lives. And we need to recognize those difficulties, face those difficulties, and thinking how we can deliver assistance better and enable people to do that without being killed. The second point in sort of why it's difficult is what I think of as the conflict conundrum. In these places, you want to support nationally led and local systems for social protection, but you need to find a way to work with government when you can't work with government. And that's just a sort of fundamental difficulty. In our work in Yemen, we talked about sort of plausible deniability, that the international aid actors have been able to work with parastatal organizations over a decade that gave them a way of working with government when they had to pretend they weren't working with government. But even that is under threat because SFD is fracturing as we speak. And so these are just difficult places. And then the third point is the tendency of the sort of social protection policy scene, which many of you have worked on over the last 10, 20 years, to not like to talk about conflict. I've read a lot of business cases and World Bank pads and social protection policies over the last 4 years. Probably some of them written by you, and quite a lot of them you can read by and not realize there's a conflict going on. And so, not pretending there's not a war going on is really important when you're trying to deliver assistance in the midst of a war. And so thinking about how you respond to the heightened levels of violence and discrimination and exclusion that go on in conflicts. So it's difficult, but what we've also been focusing on over the last 4 years is the fact that it's possible, that there have been a growth in investments in national systems and supporting social protection systems, even through periods of conflict and crisis. And across all sorts of places in Somalia and Yemen and the Sahel, there's real signs of promise in the building and sustaining of national systems. At the global level, there's a bit of policy momentum. Valentina, somewhere in this room, is going to be dashing off from this conference to be part of supporting the high-level panel on social protection in conflicts, convened by FCDO, building the momentum from a forum last year that some of you were at. And so there's a global policy momentum around how to do better on supporting social protection in conflicts. But also a source of optimism at the national level. So amongst the sort of unfolding horror of unfolding genocide in Gaza, it has been possible for some of the aid agencies in this room and people representing them to continue delivering cash to people. And that's been possible partly because of the decade of investment in social protection systems in the West Bank and Gaza. So even in the most difficult and horrific circumstances, it is possible and it is important to invest in systems that enable assistance to continue reaching people. So I'll finish with 2 sort of big questions for us to think about over the next 2 days, and we can open it up. So as Rachel started, what we're thinking about over these next 2 days is partly sort of how to protect the gains that I've just been talking about in sustaining and protecting and maintaining systems in the face of really difficult conflicts and really difficult aid cuts. How do we, continue to make the case to donors and other sources of financing for the importance of investing in systems and the value of doing that. And of course, many of us are a bunch of researchers, so what's the role of evidence in making that case for continuing to protect the gains of the investments we've already made and continuing to get assistance to people in the places where they need it most. And on that note, we can get away from the horrible pictures. Open the floor.
Should we all sit down now? Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Floor open, pick up hands and ask the questions. We'll pass around the mic. And hopefully someone is keeping an eye on the line so we can tackle the questions there. Yep. Say your name and then ask us the question or make a point.
Good morning, hello, everyone. It's on, okay. I'm Louisa. I'm an independent researcher and practitioner, but been working with BASIC for the past 4 years. It's a question for all of you, but probably for you, Jeremy. When we're talking about the politics of social assistance, it tends to be a projection on the countries that we are researching or where, lower middle income countries. But we know that the politics in the higher income countries that are funding these programs are driving a lot of the decisions that we're seeing. So I was just wondering if you could reflect a bit on what you found through the different research themes. Thank you.
We'll collect a few. So Victor and then Stephen, and then we might come back to Joe.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Victor. I'm also an independent researcher here at BASICS. This is my question, and it's to all of us, because the whole research has been centered around fragile and conflict-affected context. But the question I keep asking myself, what exactly do we want social protection to do and achieve, particularly in relation to the conflicts that are ongoing, especially those conflicts that are protracted? What do we want social protection to actually achieve there? Because we tend to focus on health, nutrition, saving lives, and all of that. But before we came to that point, the conflict led us to that point. So what exactly do we want social protection to do? Is it just to provide nutrition, provide basic needs, and then we forget the root causes? Where did the conflict emerge from? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen Devereaux from IDS. It's very striking in the presentations and also even in the title of this conference, how we are still talking about social protection and humanitarian assistance in two separate silos. And programming and policies are set up in that way and always have been. Isn't it time, if we're talking about a reset, to start really converging them and to start talking about social protection? Instead of the World Bank social protection and labor, for example, in many countries that we work in, it should be social protection and humanitarian policy and planning. And if we do that, we can start bringing disaster relief, adaptive social protection, and long-term social protection together in a common framework, rather than keeping them in separate silos, which are artificial and unrealistic to the current world that we're living in.
Joe, why don't you take the first one from Louisa, and then whoever wants to take the difficult ones from
Thank you, Lisa, for the great question. And I'll be presenting on this at the conference, so encouraging you to come along and hear more. Yes, I mean, it's interesting that, there are a whole set of technical criteria that on paper are meant to guide, to sway how international actors intervene in protracted crises, the legitimacy of the authorities, the capacities in state structures, et cetera. The World Bank has metrics around this that they use, so on and so forth. But in our global review, which involved a whole range of interviews with global level actors, these are donor agency officials, officials from operational agencies, folks based in protracted crisis countries as well. The politics in donor countries came up quite strongly, and that ranged from the rise of right-wing populism and anti-welfarist narratives in countries such as this country and elsewhere, that there's a big pushback on this agenda in these countries, and invariably that seeps out, that affects commitments and aid discourses. Issues around migration as well. Not least the European Commission having massive programs, billions of assistance to Turkey and other countries to try to prevent migration flows to Europe. So those sets of issues loom large, and the sense that we gathered from our interviews is that there isn't enough attention on that. And talking about the politics, we want to focus on what's happening domestically in these recipient settings. But we're missing something big if we're not casting a light on how the politics in donor countries is also swaying towards different approaches.
Okay. I've got a mic that so that you can show that. Yeah, thank you, Victor, for that question. And also I encourage others. These are not just questions for us. You guys have got lots of views on this. What exactly do we want social protection to do in relation to conflict? Well, I guess, what do we want social assistance, humanitarian assistance to do? I would say definitely keep protecting lives throughout. But of course, that's very much sort of a reactive thing, isn't it? And it's like, let's just make sure people are fed and watered. Of course, we want to do that. But as we have said for years, particularly IDS, we would rather be tackling the root causes as much as we can with those interventions. So to the extent we can provide those interventions in a conflict-sensitive way, we'll do it. But in fact, if we can actually do good, we will do it. So if we think about outcomes to do with social cohesion, state building legitimacy, definitely building trust, we will do that. We should be doing that. In fact, WFP's got a big focus on that, particularly with school feeding in emergencies, looking at what are the pathways to trying to provide school feeding in a way that brings communities, otherwise fractured ethnic groups together around food, and what can you do within those environments that actually try to promote peace. So we need to be thinking, and we are, as a sector, are thinking more about how we can build that into our programs, but something for us to talk about. One of the plenaries tomorrow will try and push a bit more on that social cohesion thing. We don't have a lot on it, but I think it'd be good to talk about.
Yeah, on Victor's question, I think Rachel's already talked about Christmas tree-itis, where we load up social protection with absolutely everything. And I think that's one of the things that we want to address. And that's why we are pushing for a big focus in these contexts on protecting human capital. You can call it saving lives to take it further, but focusing on not having the erosion of education, health, nutrition outcomes in those situations. Beyond that, I think we've just got to be really careful about causation and sequencing, right? So the ways in which people have talked about the relationship between social protection and conflict has often been kind of route one and very, very simplistic, and has tended to get merged into if you do social protection, you can solve a conflict. I think you can't. You can maybe prevent or reduce the severity of conflict, stop it from happening in the first place, where social protection is part of a much broader range of services provided under a political settlement or a social contract that make people trust the state and believe in what it does, right? But that's kind of stopping it from happening in the first place. It's not resolving conflicts. And I think if we start to think about it like that, we might, and be a bit cautious about it, we might make more progress. On Stephen's question, I think you're right about one element of this, but I don't agree with you on the whole thing, right? So if we think of instruments within social protection and within humanitarian assistance, yes, there are these instruments that are almost identical and trying to do the same things, especially when we're trying to protect human capital. So on that element, I think it's right. But I think if we proceed down those lines, we start to create a false equivalency between a humanitarian response and social protection. And I don't think they're the same thing. I think if you look at social welfare theories, you have approaches that are called residual social welfare, which are your last resort when the state fails, when family support fails, when community and the jobs market fails, you need residual support. And humanitarian is by definition a residual source of support. On the other hand, social protection belongs under that heading of institutional social welfare that is associated with rights and entitlements, predictability, and so on. And I think there are risks bringing them together, particularly in ministries, where my concern is that it then starts to become okay for international humanitarian actors to start delivering social protection in the long term. And that's a pathway away from states having self-determination about the kinds of programs that they have. So some of it you're right about on instruments, I think, but the other parts of it I think are a really risky road to take.
Just a couple of points to add on Victor's point. I think one, and it's kind of linked to Stephen's point. One of the things I think the social protection crowd have been bad at doing is talking enough to peace building actors and conflict advisors, and so thinking about how and if social protection might contribute to root causes. And so in coordinating and thinking about social protection's place in crisis, it's important to talk to humanitarian actors. It's also important to talk to peace building actors. And we've been bad at doing that. We were criticised at the forum we held last year for not having any peace building people there. There probably aren't enough peace building people here. So we need to be better at bringing those communities together. On your point, Stephen, we tried to embase it to some of the conversion you're talking about. We talked about social assistance and tried to say that encompasses social protection and humanitarian assistance in crisis. We ended up just confusing everyone. So the title in this conference had gone back to separating it. And it's hard. I mean, IDS has been writing about linking relief and development for a long time. You probably wrote some of the original stuff more than 30 years ago in the 1994 Linking Relief and Development Bulletin. So this is not an easy nut to crack. And for some of the reasons Rachel's just been talking about. Let's put the floor back there.
We also have live stream.
Okay, yes. Victor, I'm not sure we're at a point just yet, but we'll see if we've got time. Person in front of you. And then, but yeah, we'll get 2 points in the room and then we'll go online.
Hi, my name is Para Hunsai. I just had from World Food Program from Southern Africa. I think on just the question about what should we really be doing and moving away from this Christmas tree scenario, I think it's really timely for operational people, practitioners on the field, to really have a very clear roadmap about when you have this percentage of funding of what is needed, what are the kind of tiered levels of assistance that are necessary? Because in the absence of that, I think people try to do everything. And it's something as a practitioner, it's been quite frustrating. And I think and I know that that's not an easy thing to come up with, but I think we need to realize that we have to come up with something that is good enough, because in the absence of that, we might actually be doing more damage than good.
Got to cut you short.
Oh, sorry.
2 more seconds.
2 more seconds. Okay, and the last point on the convergence between humanitarian and social protection. I'm still relatively new to social protection, so it's just more of a question. What do you see the role of the disaster management authorities in the governments? Is that not supposed to be part of a truly shock responsive social protection system?
Come around here, yeah. And then we'll go online, and then we'll have probably that might have to be it. We'll have one more set of responses.
Thank you very much. My name is Tahira Mohammed. I work for the International Livestock Research Institute. My question is, with the emerging push towards humanitarian and special reaction, where does social protection sit?
Thank you. Questions online?
I didn't need to.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So Katie Jakeman says the number of older people globally is increasing and they are disproportionately impacted in humanitarian crises. What have you learned from your research about how systems are adapting to aging populations while dealing with rising conflict, climate change and displacement? Claire McLaughlin says you keep mentioning the social contract, but do you critically problematize what this means in protracted crises contexts, and indeed whether this Western notion applies in situations of long-term state neglect and rival claims to authority? And I'll just say one more. There are additional ones. Nadia Giski says, They would welcome reflection on different stages of conflict and how it impacts donor and partners' approaches. For example, some donors might be reluctant to invest in systems strengthening unless a peace process is firmly in place.
Great. Does anyone want to tackle any of those?
Did you deliberately choose the most difficult question?
I can go first on the roadmap, I guess. So, I mean, yes, I see your point, but we're in a context of really dramatic aid cuts when, you know, we're talking about ruthless prioritization. So I guess the fear is that in ruthlessly prioritizing, investment in systems and social protection falls down. And that's, I think, what we need to think about how we avoid and make the case for social protection systems strengthening's place in a ruthlessly prioritized set of investments.
I can have a quick go at two of them. So on how are systems adapting to aging populations? In the work that I've been doing, particularly in MENA and particularly in Syria and Iraq, aging populations and access to pensions are probably one of the things that does get sustained compared to lots of other programming. It's such a big part of the commitments that governments in Syria and Iraq have made over decades, and such a big part of the entitlements that they do get protected. The challenge there is bringing people outside of government employment, and there aren't that many people outside of government employment in some of the countries that we work in the Middle East. You know, government might account for 70 or 80% of employment. But what we find there is that organisations like ILO are having a really, really big push on how you bring more informal sector workers in. So for me, I recognise the risks of that, but I think it's one of the areas where we're making more progress rather than that getting left behind. And then the question from Claire online on social contracts, I think Claire's right that we have to be really cautious about importing a very Western concept, the idea of the barbarian state and so on, into some of the contexts that we work in. But when you work in Syria and Iraq and you have the history of Ba'athist parties who see their role as protecting people, providing them with employment and supporting them when they're vulnerable, there is a very, very clear social contract around that, you know, post Saddam Hussein still continues in Iraq, is likely to continue, we're not sure yet, in Syria post-Assad. And it is absolutely part of the social contract in those countries that the state provides subsidised access to consumption. So I think in the places where we're working, we are being careful about not importing a concept from somewhere else, but we are thinking really carefully about how it's been applied, in this case through Arab nationalist politics.
Yeah, I'll take Tahir's question on anticipatory action agenda. We've not really engaged with that vocabulary directly as such. Yet I think, you know, one of the arguments for social protection in these places for a long time has been that, you know, food secure, nourished populations that are able to hold on to some assets are going to be better prepared for risks and uncertainties as well. And so I think there is obviously a very strong case for how social protection, as well as long-term regularized humanitarian assistance in some of the most difficult places can contribute to that.
Do you want to go?
Why don't you go, Paul?
Well, I was going to suggest we've kind of answered everyone, not very well, but that's the nature of these things. We can have one or two more questions if I shut up. So Suzanne, over to you.
Thank you. I'm just sitting here thinking, I mean, it seems like a general acceptance, well, aid is reduced, so we must target better, must think of other ways to provide aid. I mean, what's the scope for resistance? I mean, do we just have to sit here and say, right, the FCDO doesn't have money, we'll just, you know, see how we can distribute limited amounts of aid? I mean, is there a way of kind of, well, first of all, kind of acknowledging that aid in the past wasn't perfect? Think about what kind of aid system we want, which is, of course, part of the reset and everything, but also kind of think through what are the longer term implications of these kind of cuts in aid? I mean, I'm just thinking from the top of my head, but it seems like this, you know, oh, well, that's what's happening. Let's just kind of see how best to deal with it. Is there another response?
Have we got one gentleman at the back? I'm going to
Online?
skip you, Carla, and we're going to come for one online. I'm under instructions to finish a few minutes early, so it's fine with me.
Thank you so much for all of this. My name is Masra Taye. I focus on climate risk insurance. I work for the African Development Bank. So I liked the idea of focusing or integrating local and informal systems in terms of social protection. Nevertheless, particularly in the areas that I'm working in the dryland systems, these informal or local systems has been both a target because they are mostly mobilized under proximity, clan, and kinship. So let's say in the case of the Ethiopian conflict where I came from, these types of systems has been a target to be attacked. At the same time, they are also they are very fluid to also attack others in terms of conflict. So my question is, do you see in your research or have you explored that fluid or the gray area of understanding the trends, the patterns of mobilizing local informal systems in terms of social protection and conflict, so that where does state and non-state actors can actually understand in terms of engaging these informal systems? Thank you so much.
One online, and then we'll have some final thoughts from us, and then.
So Yohambele Tashomi asks, with the big funding cuts and protracted crises caused particularly by conflict and climate change, how can we support and strengthen local self-help institutions?
Cool, that's two very big questions. So I'll let someone take those. Thank you, Rachel. And then any final thoughts you want to go across?
Great, thank you. Well, I'm pleased to say that on the local informal systems, we have a whole session on that you yourself will be answering that question for us. But we have actually, as you know, looked into these localization, local initiatives very much. It's been part of the agenda, but it's also, you know, Vincent's here, he's been leading that as well, sort of more of a global thing. How do we think more about encouraging, facilitating the local, but then also not sort of dominating it and squashing it? Because I think you're right, in Ethiopia we do see that sort of with the rolling back of aid and funding, particularly to the PSMP, I mean, we were even talking about it recently, that the government, particularly local, is getting very, like, we're actually going to enforce these local mechanisms of solidarity now, and you guys will pay up, and this is what you will do. So they're no longer these sort of organic things that necessarily serve people's needs, but the government's great, I'm going to jump on board with that, and we're going to use that, and all of a sudden it becomes an instrument of the state, whereas before it was sort of an organic mechanism that was reacting to local needs. So I think these things are really interesting. I don't have a very specific question, but it's something we hope to really interrogate in the next 2.5 days.
Great, Jeremy. Like 30 seconds each.
I'll respond to Susan's question. It's a great question, and we did a lot of hand wringing when we were producing the key messages about how much we needed to pivot and face the threats to international aid architecture, and how much we should say, well, that's a storm that's happening right now, but we want the legacy of our work to live beyond that storm, and the world might be a different place in 3 or 4 years' time. What are we saying to help if and when we come out of the other side of that? And so that's part of it. And then I think the other part of it is choosing what kinds of policy engagement or activism or influencing we do. And I think one of the challenges we have as basic research is some of us are activists and want to lobby and advocate and play a real challenge function to government agencies and the UN and so on. And some of us want to be, I think it's Carla who uses the word soft influencing, who want to try and work from within and gently and slowly be a critical but trusted friend. And I think all of us in the room need to figure out what it means to be one of those two different things and how we go about it. And our challenge as Basic is it's not easy to be multiple things all at once.
That's great. I'll let that be the last word, avoid the temptation to put my toughest words in, and we'll call it to a halt, and we'll hand over to June. Thank you.